Okay, you ready?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay. All right. It's Chanukah this week and also Parshas Vayeishev. Now, there's a question asked. I see that it was asked by the Sam Sofer and by my uncle and others as well, as to because Vayeishev is usually it's the Shabbos before Hanukkah. This year it's the Shabbos Hanukkah. So they assume that there has to be a connection between Chanukah and Parshas Vayeishev. And the question is, what is the connection between Chanukah and Parshas Vayeishev? And each one gave his own teretz, his own pshat, his own understanding. Now, to be honest, I would not have been bothered by this question had I not seen that the Chassam Sofer and my uncle asked that question. And the reason for that is because the Sedros was instituted by Ezra HaSofer, and Ezra was before the whole miracle of Hanukkah took place. But there is a Lubavitcher tradition, and I heard from my father that there was a similar tradition in our family. Lubavitchers referred to Kivu Itam La Torah, which, according to the simple explanation, the Pashut explanation, and the very true explanation, is that you have to set times for learning Torah, but they have an additional explanation, typical of the Hasidic approach, that all the questions, and my father would phrase it the same way, except he didn't mention Kivu Itam La Torah. All the questions that come up should be dealt with from the perspective of the Sedra of the week. So it's somehow, for some reason, there is a relationship between all the future events that take place and the Sedra of the week. Now, so from that perspective, obviously there might be a connection between Parshas Vayeishev and Chanukah, the events of Chanukah. And then there is an opinion of the Ritva. There are some that say that the Rambam agreed with the Ritva. There are some that say that the Rambam disagreed with the Ritva. But the Ritva's opinion is that even a Takanas Chachamim, any law that was instituted by the sages, has to have a source in the Torah. And when we refer to an asmachta was not just a medium that they attached their takana to, but the asmachta is actually exeres hakasuv that allows the chachamim to make that takana. So if the chachamim suggested that we not suggested, if the chachamim instituted that we have to observe Hanukkah, and the chachamim instituted the sedros of the week, all that is based on indications in the Torah that allow them to institute these takanas, these laws. Then there certainly would possibly be a connection between Chanukah and the Sedra of the week. Now, and matter of fact, Rashi at the beginning of Parshas Vayechi, depends how you understand the Rashi. Maybe when we get to Parshas Vayechi, I'll discuss it. But Rashi at the beginning of Parshas Vayechi asks how the Sedra starts off without any space in the Torah between Vayechi and the end of Vayigash. Now Rashi is obviously assumed that, and then he says that we learn out certain things from that. So apparently he held that when Ezra instituted the Sedra Vayechi from Vayigash, they separated the two into two separate Sedras. Obviously, that it was not something that originated with Ezra, but is something that he had been Masorah. Now, however, and because of this, I want to explain what the connections between Parshas Vayeishev and Chanukah are. And we have to understand that Parshas Vayeishev is really the beginning of a unit of 3 or 4 sedras, which talk about the Mechir of Yosef, the selling of Yosef. Now, there is another question, and that question was asked by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe gave an answer on the basis of Kabbalah. I want to answer it in a very simple manner. The Rambam at the end of Hilchos Chanukah mentions the law, which is mentioned in the Gemara and Shabbos. Hayu lefanav ner beiso v'ner Chanukah. If a person has before him a choice between buying a Chanukah candle and buying a candle for a Shabbos candle, or he has a choice between a Shabbos candle and buying wine for Kiddush, ner beiso kodem. So the Shabbos candle takes precedence over the Chanukah candle and over wine for Kiddush. And the question is why? Mishum shalom beiso, because of peace in the house. In other words, part of the reason for the Shabbos candle is that the Shabbos candle contributes towards peace in the house. So the Gemara tells us that if you don't have a Shabbos candle, in those days they didn't have electric lights, so very often the house would be dark, people would trip over things. And people get very frustrated when these type of things happen. And when there's frustration, it very often causes disharmony between spouses. So the Shabbos candle is identified with Shalom Bayis, with peace in the home. And then the Rambam goes almost sermonic in talking about the significance of peace. Shaharei Hashem nimchak laso shalom beinish lishto, because the name of God by Sota is erased in order to make peace between husband and wife. And then the Rambam continues, Gadol HaShalom, greatest peace, Shekol HaTorah Nitna Laso Shalom B'Olam, because the whole Torah was given to make peace in the world. Shenemar, as it says, Dracheha Darkeinom B'Chol Nesiveh Shalom, all its roads and its pathways are peace. So the question is, and this question was raised by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, why does the Rambam mention that over here? In other words, he's talking about the significance of peace. Of course, there is a quick reference here to the Shabbos candle. But it would seem that the more appropriate places to go into this sermonic approach about the significance of peace would have been in Hilchos Shabbos, in the laws of Shabbos, where they discuss the laws of the Shabbos candle, or in Hilchos Ishus, in the laws that discuss marriage. It seems, on contrary, Chanukah is identified with victory of war. Why does the Rambam here go into this whole speech about the significance of peace from a Torah perspective? It's true, but there would have been more appropriate places for the Rambam to mention it. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe said the fact that he ends Hilchos Chanukah with it is indicative that this is related to Chanukah, not just to the Shabbos candle. Now, it's true, there are other places, very few, where the Rambam, at the end of halachas concerning other dinim, mentions similar reasons that do not have to do with the main topic, but just with the last law. But the Mefarshim, the commentaries in those cases, ask the same question. Sometimes you'll find it in the Nosei Kalims. There's one case where it's discussed in the Shelos Tshuvas Radvaz. But here, I'm not aware, besides the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of anybody who asked this question. And then, so many years ago, I was giving a shiur for many rabbis. And at that time, I mentioned a certain teretz, an answer. I'll mention what that answer was. But since that time, I have thought of other answers. The Meshech Chochmah. Now it seems that the Meshech Chochmah was somewhat of a pacifist. And the Meshech Chochmah says that Purim is not so much the celebration of the victory of the war, that the Jewish people won against the forces of those who had been associated with Haman. But matter of fact, the war took place. The war took place on Yud Gimel on the 13th. But we celebrate on the 14th and on the 15th. Like the days that the Jews were at rest from their enemies. In Shushan, the war was 2 days. So that's why Shushan and all the cities that have walls around them that are identified with Shushan, or might be identified with Shushan, so they celebrate on the 15th. Why? Because for them, for the walled cities, the day of peace, Shushan, was on the 15th. And for the non-walled cities, the day of peace was on the 14th. So according to the Meshech Chochmah, the celebration of Chanukah, of Purim, is a celebration not of the victory of the war, but the celebration of Chanukah is a celebration of being at peace. And he mentions also that many Rishonim say, why is Chanukah called Chanukah? Because Chanu ba ha-Yehudim mesonehem, which according to some means that the Jewish people on the 25th were at rest. Now, there's some question about how much rest they wore on the 25th, because the war against the Syrian Greeks continued for many, many years, but it does appear from historians that there was a lull in the war. Many of the armies of Yehuda did not want to continue fighting. And we could also suggest that up to that point, the war was not just a war against the Syrian Greeks. On the contrary, the war was against the Hellenist Jews. Hanukkah was a civil war. And perhaps from 25th of Kislev onward, the Syrian Greeks came in to support the Hellenist Jews. But it could be the main thrust of the war afterwards was a war against the Syrian Greeks, not so much anymore against the Hellenists. Once Yerushalayim was captured and the Beis Hamikdash was declared to be Tahor, and the Avodah and the service of God was restored to the Beis Hamikdash, so it's possible that Chanu HaYehudim, they were at rest from fighting their brothers. A civil war came to an end. And it's very interesting that the beginning of Vayeishev, Rashi, Vayeishev Yaakov Beretz Mugurei Ovid Beretz Canaan. So Rashi says, Vayeishev Yaakov, Bitesh Yaakov, Leishe B'Shalva. Yaakov thought that after all the trouble he went through, after all the fighting with Esav, the fighting with the Malach of Esav, the fighting with Lavan, but some of these weren't real wars, but there was concern that it would lead to fighting. The fighting with the people of Shechem, and the Ramban cites a medrash that the cities around Shechem organized armies against the Jewish people after the sons of Yaakov killed the people of Shechem. So maybe finally, he didn't have to worry about the enemies outside the border. He thought that he was finally at rest. He reached that goal. Kafsalo Rogso Shel Yosef. Because of that, the anguish of the Yosef being sold, being lost. He thought Yosef was killed. Jumped upon him. What's the idea? The idea is that we very often think that we're at peace when there is peace at the borders. But true peace can only be there when there's peace within the borders. And the most significant form of peace is peace within the family and within the house. So we could suggest, using the Meshech Chochmah's approach, that Chanukah, Chanukah, it was a holiday of peace. And it was a peace, perhaps, in the sense they weren't fighting. Brother and brother wasn't fighting. And Parshas Vayeishev talks about the tragedy of internal strife within a family, of sibling rivalry. And the whole unit of the three sedras comes to an end with peace being restored into the house of Yaakov. So we begin right around Chanukah, which is the celebration of the end of a civil war among the Jewish people, with Parshas Vayeishev, which is the beginning of this struggle that took place between Yosef and his brothers. Now, that was the answer that I gave at that time. And with that, we could also explain the Rambam. In other words, because Hanukkah is the celebration of peace. And if it's the celebration of peace, so we understand why the Rambam concludes Hilchos Chanukah about the significance of peace. And he emphasizes peace is not just at the borders, peace is within the borders, peace is important within the home. However, I have my doubts presently whether that's the pshat in the Rambam. And I'll explain why. First of all, I am not convinced that the Rambam understood the word Chanukah to mean Chanuka. My uncle suggests that the Rambam could have understood it that way also, for other reasons. But the simple reading, the simple explanation of Hanukkah, and since the Rambam doesn't emphasize the Chanukah, I have my doubts that the Rambam understood Hanukkah to mean Chanukah. But even if we accept the pshat of the Rishonim, that Hanukkah means Chanukah, they rested on the 25th. Even if we accept that pshat, the Bach cites a Maharil, and the Maharil says that there was a minhag, a custom, not to do any malacha, not to do any work on the first day of Hanukkah and on the 8th day of Hanukkah. And the Bach cites support for the Maharil because of what the Rishonim say, that Hanukkah means Chanukah. He says it's a dochek to suggest that Chanukah means they rested from war. Perhaps because the war continued. He says Chanukah, they rested from doing work. So there was a custom, and apparently in the early days of Hanukkah also, there was a custom. It's certainly not a halacha, but there was a custom not to do malacha. Now, how malacha is defined, that might be a variable. It certainly doesn't mean the lamed tes malachas. But there was a custom not to do malacha, not to do work on the first day of Hanukkah and on the 8th day of Hanukkah. And I think the question is, why should that be? Well, there could be two reasons for it. One reason, we see that Beis Shammai says that we do. Beis Shammai says that we the first day, we don't paskin like Beis Shammai, but Beis Shammai says, actually the Mishnah Brura seems to indicate that a person could do, I think he says according to Miri, you could do like Beis Hillel, you could do like Beis Shammai, but from the Rishonim it doesn't appear that way. Most of the Rishonim, he says that Beis Shammai Shita is that we do 8 candles the first day, 7 candles the second day, 6 candles the third day. And the question is why? So there are 2 explanations mentioned in the Gemara. But one explanation mentioned in the Gemara is that Chanukah, that the number of candles correspond with the order of the bulls that were given on Sukkot. And the number of bulls given on Sukkot was in descending order. So just as sacrifices. So just as the sacrifices, the bulls given in the sacrifices of Sukkot was in descending order, so too Chanukah, the candles are in descending order. And the question is, what is the connection between Chanukah and Sukkot? Now, historians say something, but I think Yikar Chosim in a Sefer, historians say that Chanukah, the first Chanukah anyway, was observed as the replacement from Sukkot. And they even mention historical records that indicate that on the first Chanukah, they took lulavim and esrogim, and because they have sort of guilt feelings that they weren't able to observe Sukkot because of the war that they had with the Greeks. And to me, that's somewhat so. There is a connection between Chanukah and Sukkot. And they say that's the reason why Chanukah has 8 days. To me, that's somewhat strange. I think that the connection under the Greeks, I'm sure the overwhelming majority of Jews, certainly in the later years of the war, were not able to observe the other holidays either. So why is it that Sukkot was identified with Chanukah? And it might be true that they identified it with Sukkot. And it might be true, as historians claim, that they took lulavim and esrogim, not that there wouldn't be some halachic shaylos about it. But I think the real reason is because Sukkot is the holiday of the Mizbeach. It's the holiday of the altar. The Simchas Beis Sheva. The Jewish people say, pointing to the Mizbeach and say, Yofi lach Mizbeach, Yofi lach Mizbeach. It's brought down that the Hellenists, when they entered the Beis HaMikdash, they disgraced the Mizbeach, the altar, more than anything else. There was one lady who was from the family of Kohanim, who was a Hellenist, and she took her shoe and she banged the Mizbeach. And she said to the Mizbeach, she said to the altar, she was trying to disgrace the Mizbeach in front of Jews, and said, you eat mamono shel Yisrael. You eat the money of the Jewish people with the karbanos that they gave, but you don't help them in their time of trouble. So Chanukah is the day of the dedication of the Mizbeach, the dedication of the altar. And we see with Chanukah, what do we read in the Torah? About the karbanos that the Nesiim gave at the time of the dedication of the altar of the Mishkan. So Chanukah is the holiday of the Mizbeach, of the altar. So because of that, Chanukah is identified with Sukkot. Sukkot was the holiday of the altar. More kabbanos were given on Sukkot than any other holiday. They had the Simchas Beis Sheva. They went around the altar. The Hushanis. Because of that, to a certain degree, Beis Hillel held that Chanukah was that Sukkot was the blueprint to a certain degree for Chanukah. And it's very interesting that in of course, the Gemara cites a brisa says differently, but the Megillas Tainus cites what's the reason that Chanukah is 8 days? Because the celebration of the altar, the dedication of the altar, in the time of the Chashmonaim was 8 days. So the whole celebration, to a certain degree, the celebration of Chanukah is the celebration of the altar. It's true. We light the menorah, but the menorah was lit with the fire from the Mizbeach, with the fire from the altar. A person could suggest that that is the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai is of the opinion that the main celebration of Chanukah is the celebration of the altar, whereas Beis Hillel held the main celebration of Chanukah is the celebration of the menorah. It's possible for someone to suggest that, but we could say even Beis Hillel understood that there is the celebration of Chanukah is a celebration also of the altar. So because of that, we could suggest that is the equation. That is why there was a minhag developed, and perhaps it was based on the original observance of Chanukah, that the first day and the last day to refrain from malacha, to refrain from work. Because when we refrain from work, so it comes exactly like Sukkot. Of course, the nature of the work is different. The first day is special, the last day is special. So it's identified more with Sukkot. And but there is another possible explanation. And the other possible explanation, I'll say it very quickly, it's a little bit off topic. There is a dispute whether Kalamow, and now there's no question, Chanukah you put tefillin on every day except Shabbos. So I don't want anybody to make that mistake. That I've heard of some cases where people made a mistake. There is an argument whether Kalamow one puts on tefillin or one does not put on tefillin on Kalamow. And what's the argument? Now, the question is, certain work is prohibited on Kalamow. Now, the rule is that why don't we put on tefillin on Yontif and Shabbos? Because Yontif and Shabbos is a nos, it's a sign. And tefillin is a sign. So we don't put on tefillin on days that are signs. So the question is, what is the sign of Yontif and Shabbos? Is it the Dushas Hayom, the sanctity of the day, the mitzvos of the day? In which case, Kalamow also has mitzvos. Pesach has the prohibition of chametz. According to some, there's a mitzvah of eating matzah every day, not a requirement. Or is it the prohibition of, in which case, so Kalamow wouldn't put on tefillin. And it certainly has the sanctity of the day. Or is it the prohibition of work? Because certain work is prohibited. So, which is on Shabbos, we know, biblically, we're prohibited from doing work. Yontif, we're biblically prohibited from doing work. Certain work is prohibited on Kalamow also. But there's a disagreement whether it's prohibited biblically or only rabbinically. So if we say that it's prohibited only rabbinically, and if we say the oath, the sign is the prohibition to do work, So then Kalamow isn't an os. And if it's not an os, you can put tefillin on. The problem is, Rashi's opinion is that you put tefillin on. And Rashi's opinion also is that work on Kalamow is prohibited biblically. And this is a question that the Mishkanesh Yaakov raises against Rashi. Now, I think there's a simple answer. In other words, we have to understand what is the idea when we have a 7 or 8 day holiday, and the first and last day are special Yom Tovim. So is it that the significance of the middle days of the Kalamow is that they connect the first day with the last day? Or no, when we have an 8-day holiday, that necessitates that the first day and last day be special Yom Tovim. So Rashi's opinion is that the middle days get their significance from the first and last days, or maybe just from the first days, because they attach the first day to the last days. So since they don't have significance in themselves, but they get their significance from other days, so whether it's a prohibition of malacha or mitzvos or whatever, it doesn't have that chshivus. It doesn't have that self-importance that it should be considered an os. But we could say the reverse. We could say it's not because there's a first day and a last day that there are middle days. On the contrary, it's because we have a 7 or 8 day holiday that the beginning and the end of a holiday has to be special days. And we could say that if we say that, we could say that's why Jews refrained from doing malacha. It wasn't the halacha, but they refrained from doing malacha because they wanted to treat it the way one treats a yontif. When you have a yontif of 7 or 8 days, the custom was to observe the first day and the last day in a maximum manner, in refraining from doing work. Not a custom, that's the law, but it was a custom in regard to Chanukah. Now, but in any case, the Maharil and the Bach, they say that when we say Chanukah, it does not have reference to the war. As the Meshech Chochmah assumes, and there are Rishonim that seem to say like the Meshech Chochmah, it has reference to refraining from doing work. So then it doesn't really have anything to do with the idea of peace. And I think if you take a look at the Rambam, he doesn't emphasize at the beginning when he talks about the name Chanukah that it has to do with peace. But my uncle feels that it could be read into the Rambam. Okay. So the question is, so how are we to understand to answer the question? Now, there is a discussion. The Gemara tells us that there are 3 levels of in the mitzvah of Chanukah. The main level today, people don't do it that way, but in the old days, when people lit by the door, there were those who lit 1 candle each night of Chanukah, irregardless of which night it was, and irregardless of how many people they were in the house. That's the mitzvah. Ner ishu beso, 1 candle for a person in his whole house. And there's a discussion. What's the explanation? Is the explanation that the mitzvah of Chanukah candles is a mitzvah on the household? Or is it, no, it's a mitzvah on the individual. It's a mitzvah on the individual. But all the people in the household could fulfill their individual mitzvah with the one candle that was lit for the household. I heard a shir from my father about it. It was a shir that he gave in memory of Rav Hutner, whose yahrzeit is today. Rav Hutner was my father's Rabbi teacher when my father was 12 years old in Warsaw. And my grandfather was my father's main Rebbe, but my grandfather went to America for a year before the family came. And he engaged Rav Hutner to be my father's Rebbe. And even though he was a Rebbe only for 1 year, my father would always say that the impact of learning with Rav Hutner for 1 year had a impact on him for the rest of his life. So this was the what I'm going to say now was from that shir. So my father felt that it's dependent upon an argument. You can say all kinds of other pshatim. This my father felt. My father felt that let's say there is an argument. The second level is to light candles for communion on Shabbayis. Let's say there are 5 people in the house. So the first night you light 5 candles. The second light, this is the Mahadrin, the better mitzvah, the nicer mitzvah. Those who run after mitzvahs, they light 5 candles the first night, 5 candles the second night, the third 5 candles the third night. And again, the same question could ask: is each candle for 1 candle for each individual, or is it 5 candles for the whole household? And then there's the Mahadrin Min HaMahadrin, the super mitzvah. That there you light the first night 1 candle, the second night 2 candles, the third night 3 candles. And Tosfos' opinion is that you light the first night, irregardless of how many people are in the house. You light 1 candle the first night, 2 candles the second night, 3 candles the third night. And that is the custom of Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews, even if there are 10 people in the house, they have 1 menorah for the whole household. So my father said their opinion is that Chanukah candles is just a mitzvah on the household. It's not a mitzvah on the individual, because 1 person lights for the whole household. The Rambam has a similar opinion, but different. He says if there are 5 people in the house, the first night, the Baal Habayis, 1 person lights 5 candles, the second night 10 candles, the third night 15 candles, but you don't have each individual lighting his own candle. But the Ramah's opinion is that where you can accommodate such a situation, each person lights his own candles. So my father felt that according to the Ramah, and that is the custom of the Ashkenazic Jews, except the German Jews, the custom of Ashkenazic Jews that each person lights his own menorah. So why? Because really it's a mitzvah on the individual. And when they said all you need is 1 candle for the basic mitzvah, it's because each individual fulfills his mitzvah with that 1 candle. But it's a separate mitzvah for each individual. It's not a household mitzvah. Seemingly, however, the opinion of the opinion of the Ramah is that each person lights his own candle. I'm sorry. The opinion of Tosfos and the Rambam that only 1 person lights for the whole household. So it's a mitzvah only on the household. Now, what would seem to be the difference, and I'm going to suggest that that's not true, but let's say you have people that are outside, live on the street. Unfortunately, that happens. And perhaps that's not necessarily dependent upon that. When people are traveling and they're not in their house, is there a requirement of lighting Hanukkah candles? If it's an opinion, if it's on the household, so if I'm out on the street, so there's no household there. It's like Mezuzah. If you live on the street, there's no mitzvah of Mezuzah. But if it's a mitzvah on the individual, so I would say wherever you are, you would have to light the Hanukkah candle. Now, if a person is one individual in a house, it's still it could be a responsibility of the household. You can have a household of one, and you can have a household of 10. But it's a house. It's a home. So but there's a problem with that. And the problem with that is that the Rambam in Hilchos Brachos, he says you have all kinds of mitzvahs. You have mitzvahs that are situational. And he gives us an example. A mitzvah that's situational is Mezuzah. Mezuzah, he says, is if you live in a house, you have to put a mezuzah on. He says you're not required to build a house or to buy a house in order to fulfill the mitzvah mezuzah. But if you live in a house, you have to put up a mezuzah. He says if you're on a boat, okay, you're probably talking about like a rowboat. You have boats that are like houses. But if you're on a boat, there is no mitzvah of mezuzah. He even says a tent, which has to be understood. But that's another thing. So there's no mitzvah of mezuzah. So it's a situational mitzvah. He says, but candles of Shabbos and candles of Hanukkah, that's not a situational mitzvah. He compares it to like the mitzvah of tefillin. The mitzvah of tefillin is not a situational mitzvah. The mitzvah of Hanukkah candles is not a situational mitzvah. So the question is, if it's a mitzvah in the household, how could you say it's not a situational mitzvah? But the answer, and this answer was suggest that I said it when I was regarding what my father said at that time in the share regarding what Rav Hutner, in memory of Rav Hutner, but I saw my uncle said the same thing about the Ram Shita, but for a different reason. Rav Michal Shurkin, who wrote over my uncle's shiurim, he also suggested. In other words, even if it's a din on the household, but it's a chiyuv, it's a requirement on the individual. The individual is required to make sure he's part of a household on Chanukah. In other words, he has to try his best to be part of a household on Chanukah. You can be a guest, but you're part of the household. It's brought down that if you're a guest, you give a pruta, you give a coin to the balabayas, and you're included in his lighting. So it's requirement. So it's a requirement to be. So the question is, what's the logic for this? Now, and then we have to ask another question, and that question is, under laboratory conditions, which we don't have here in the United States, the mitzvah of lighting Hanukkah candles is either at the doorway of the chutzner, of the courtyard, on the outside, in the public domain, in the Rishus HaRabim, or it's lighting it, according to Rashi, on the outside of one's doorway of their house. So the question is, and it's brought down that a person should, that the mezuzah is on the right side of the doorway, the Chanukah candles on the left side of the doorway, and then there are texts that say Balabayas Benza, the Balabayas stands between them. One says he stands between them wearing a talis, and there's another text wearing talis and tefillin. A little difficult how you can wear tefillin. Why there should be a mitzvah at night to wear tefillin? We could say that the Brisker Rav said that really the mitzvah Hanukkah candles is to light it right before sunset, so it should be lit with sunset. According to the Brisker Rav, we can understand it very well, but the question is, what's the reason for this? Why is it that the Hanukkah candles should be lit by the doorway? What's the reason that it should be to get the opposite, the Mezuzah, and some say with talis and tefillin? What's the idea behind all of this? Now, there is a disagreement. But the question is, let's say I live in a section that's not a Jewish section. So the question is, I light by the window, but the question is, am I required to light by the window? In other words, you're required to light by the outside, that the people on the outside should see it, because of Pesumei Nisa, to make the miracle known. But a person could argue that that's only if there are Jews in the section. But if you don't live in a Jewish section and Jews won't see the Hanukkah candles, there's no purpose in lighting it by the window. And from the Rif, that appears to be true. However, in Rashi, there's a disagreement. I don't want to get into it because it'll take a lot of time. But there are those who read Rashi, that Rashi felt that it's considered Pesumei Nisa even when there are non-Jews outside, on the outside. So the question is, why should there be a mitzvah Pesumei Nisa? And my uncle felt that that was the correct pshat in Rashi. I mentioned my father the alternative pshat, and he was well aware of it. And I told him the reasons for it, but he still felt that according to Rashi, there is Pesumei Nisa, even in a non-Jewish section, for the non-Jews that might be passing by. But what's the reason? Why by Chanukah is the mitzvah Pesumei Nisa of making the miracle known, even to the non-Jews? And my uncle explained that the reason is because the Greeks tried to stop the Jews from observing mitzvahs. So because they tried to stop the Jews from observing mitzvahs, and he mentioned that Rabbeinu Daniel Habavli says that the mitzvah Pesumei Nisa of making a miracle known is a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. And he mentioned that the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, when people try to get us not to observe mitzvahs, is to show defiance of them. So figuratively, we are showing defiance of those who tried to the Greeks, the Hellenistic Greeks. They actually were Syrians who tried to stop the Jewish people from observing Torah mitzvahs. So therefore, now the Hellenistic Greeks were certainly not Jews. So when we re-experience our defiance, we do it irregardless of who's outside. There were non-Jews, there were Jews also who tried to stop the Jews, the Hellenistic Jews. So it was a joint effort by the Hellenistic Syrians with the Greek ideology and the Hellenistic Jews. So the act of lighting the Hanukkah candles, in a sense, is re-experiencing the defiance. No, but we have to understand it even more. Why is it that way? What's the idea behind it? Now, the Rambam cites a medrash, a very interesting medrash. The Rambam cites a medrash that the Jewish people used to one of the worst decrees against the Jewish people that the Greeks made was a decree that they couldn't lock the door of their house, or that they couldn't have doors on their house. It's in the Igros Rambam. And it really, that's cited, there's a Medrash Chanukah, and that's cited in the Medrash Chanukah. So the question is, why did the Greeks make such a strange decree that the Jews shouldn't be able to lock the doors of their house, or more than that, that they shouldn't have doors in their house? And the answer is because the Greeks knew something that I think, unfortunately, some of the Rosh Yeshivas today don't understand. That you can close down the shuls, you can close down the yeshivas, but Jewish tradition will continue because of the Jewish home. So and they realized that that's what the Jews were doing. So in order to prevent the Jews from perpetuating their tradition, they wanted them to be fearful that a Greek officer might come in at any time. So they made a decree that they can't lock the doors of their house. They can't lock the doors, or they can't have doors on their house. And we could say that's the reason why the Hanukkah candle has to be lit by the door, because we want to show the Greeks, we want to re-experience our defiance. You tried to use the doorways to stop us from perpetuating our tradition. No, we will perpetuate our tradition anyway. We will continue, and we stand by the doorway, and some say with talis and tefillin, to show that Jewish tradition continues, and it continues because of the home of the Jewish people. That's why it's a mitzvah on the bias. So in other words, it's a requirement that might be a requirement on the individual, but the individual has to make himself part of a household in order to emphasize the perpetuation of Jewish tradition continues because of the homes of the Jews. I remember once someone came to complain to me about their son was in a certain yeshiva, and I think we had to do Rosh Hashanah. The grandparents were coming for Rosh Hashanah, and the school had, and I understand many schools have a rule that all the boys have to be in the yeshiva for Rosh Hashanah. It's important for the spirit of the school. But the grandparents were coming, and the boy went into the Rosh Yeshiva and he says, my grandfather, who was a survivor from the Holocaust, is going to be in my parents' house for Rosh Hashanah. I would like to spend Rosh Hashanah with my grandfather. And it wasn't just that the Rosh Yeshiva said no. I understand. I can't say that I necessarily agree with it, but okay. There were many yeshivas felt that the Rosh Hashanah, it's important to be in yeshiva. But it's what he answered. He answered that I'll be your grandfather. Yeshivas play a big role, but they cannot replace parents. And that's what the idea of Hanukkah is. And the Maccabees, the Rambam says the revolt started with one family. They had a couple supporters. And the supporters became like members of their family. The Rambam in Negro says that. So Hanukkah stresses the importance of the home, the importance of the family. But, so that's why the Hanukkah candles has to be lit at the door. That's why the fulfillment of the mitzvah, one has to be part of the family. And that's why also that's why we can explain the Rambam. The Rambam, the home is the bastion of the continuation of tradition, but it can only be the bastion of tradition, of continuation of tradition, when there's peace within the family. If there's constant fighting in the family, it can't be the bastion of the continuation of tradition, especially in times of oppression. How can we continue Jewish tradition if there's fighting within the family, within the home? And perhaps in this epidemic, we begin to realize the spiritual potential of the home, the significance of the home, the responsibility of the home to be involved in the continuation of Jewish tradition. There are a lot of things that Rosh Yeshivas can teach, and perhaps that parents can't teach. But there are a lot of things that the parents can teach that the Rosh Yeshivas and the Rebbeim can't teach. And we could say that that's why it's in Parshas Vayeishev. Parshas Vayeishev talks about strife within the family. It talks about strife within the family between Yosef and his brothers. And it's the beginning of a unit of Sedris that concludes with the Jewish people, with unity being returned to the family, with peace being returned to the family. And after, when the strife began, we saw the effect on Yaakov Avinu. Anochi Erev L'bni Shola had a negative effect psychologically. Life became a process of dying rather than a process of living. And then spiritually, we see the negative effect in this week's Sedra that it has on Yehuda. And this is, so Chanukah is dedicated to the idea to understand the importance of Jewish tradition in perpetuating the family and the home, perpetuating Jewish tradition, regardless of the circumstances that are outside on the street. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Anyone who has questions, please put them in the chat. Is there an opinion that if you're on two different streets, let's say on a corner, you have to light on each side so people on either street know that you have Ner Chanukah there? So would that be part of the household lighting, or is that so that people wouldn't think?
Well, a person could suggest that if the traffic tends to be only one way, so that would be the case. But I think today it's all based on the assumption that people think that if he didn't light on one side, he's not going to light on the other side. I don't know that that's the way people think today, you know. That's so I don't.
Someone asked, how did your uncle view public menorah lightings? Is it an act of defiance? No, I can say I looked through his book, the blue one, and he didn't have any things about public menorah lighting.
Here, if there are two approaches, I don't know what my uncle would say, you know. I'm sure there are many people that that will say what my uncle would have said. But I'll tell you my own approach. My own approach is I don't know whether a bracha should be said on it or shouldn't be said on it. It could be that a bracha could be said on it. I have a whole shir about it. There is grounds for it, but it's not compelling. However, and this is, okay, today is Chav Kislev. It's a little bit of a Lubavitcher holiday. Yesterday was the first day. They have like a 2-day holiday. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was different than the Rosh Yeshivas. The Rosh Yeshivas focus on the Jewish world from the perspective of what's necessary for the yeshiva boys, for the yeshiva community. And the yeshiva community does not need public lighting of the menorah. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe looked from other perspectives also. When a Jewish child, one who doesn't go to day school, walks through the streets, and all he sees is Christmas lights, what do you think he thinks? And what does he become impressed with? He becomes impressed. He becomes impressed with the lights, with this, that. And if he sees a Chanukah menorah there, and Chanukah decorations, so that has meaning for him as a Jew. And I could say Zocher Oseish L'Tov, because people view, it's not that he didn't have concern for the Chassidim, and that might have been his first concern, I'm not saying, but he was concerned about every Jew. And even the things that other people tend to overlook, he understood. And I think that was very important. And even the lighting, I don't do it, but let's say the Lubavitcher Chassidim put menorahs on top of their cars. Should watch out though when they go through a tunnel. The top of their cars, because we can't put decorations everywhere, but the cars go everywhere. So we're exposing the children to the idea of Jewish tradition, to the idea of Hanukkah, and it shouldn't be the only thing they see is Christmas lights.
That goes into just the interesting thing that some things that aren't a mitzvah are very important.
That's right.
Some things that are very important people make into a mitzvah.
Yeah, okay, but here it's a mitzvah of hatzolos nefashos, a spiritual nefashos. It's true. No one is going to become a shomer Shabbos by seeing one menorah, but there is an adding machine, and every little thing helps, and you don't know the effect that it has positively and the effect that it has preventing negative impact. You know, right now, there are Reform rabbis, I read an article, who are suggesting that we should do Hanukkah December 25th. It's unbelievable, and it's important for us to stress what Hanukkah is. It's not just the question of lights, and it's not just a question of presents, although they're all very important. They're all very important to stress that Hanukkah is a Jewish holiday. And this comes from the attitude, there are those who see Judaism emanating from universalism, and there are those who see universalism emanating from Judaism. Those who want to put Hanukkah on the 25th of December, besides the halachas that are being violated, and etc. Besides all of that, it's indicative that they believe Judaism emanates from universalism rather than the reverse.
A quick one. Is there? So you mentioned that we don't do this in the United States, to light outside your house next to the street. Should we try to do that? Should we not?
Well, let me put it this way. You have to consider the weather conditions. You have to consider the likelihood of the menorah being stolen. And more than anything else, you have to consider the danger from the fire. And I could say in Chicago, it wouldn't be a good idea.
But also, could we say that people, the passerby, don't know to look near the street? They look in the house, so you might have less Persume Nisa if you would light it.
I don't know. I mean, you pass by a door, you see a menorah there.
Right, but this is if you're lighting like near the sidewalk. People might
Oh,
be.
no. I don't think where you don't have a courtyard, I think it is best by the door. Rashi says that why by the door? It should be nicker that it's who's near Chanukah it is. So, like you said,
courtyard is if someone would have like a gated entrance.
A gated entrance,
then that would be the place.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think today, by the courtyard, most Rishonim say by the courtyard lechatchila. So that's most Rishonim say lechatchila by the courtyard. But if you have a gated entrance, so it could be that way. But it could be, and it should be in the Rishus Harabim part of the courtyard. You understand? You have to be outside the gate. Mm-hmm. So that might even be illegal, besides the fact that somebody might steal it. So I wouldn't recommend that for many reasons.
A question here related to Shalom. For someone who has their own household, but their parents want them to come for the candle lighting, and this year with the pandemic, you're only going to be standing outside for them. Should you light your candles first and then go to their house to watch them and wave through the window, or should you go there first and then come home and light at your house?
The question is what that has to do with. There are many serious issues involved. It's sort of complex, but a question, huh?
It's not a quick question here.
Yeah, but just quickly, it probably would have to do with what time they're lighting and what time you're lighting. That's the way I would view it. And today, and if it's a Jewish section or it's not a Jewish section. If it's not a Jewish section, so the main Pesumei Nisa is on the inside of the house, so then you can do it anytime during the night. If it's a Jewish section, so then we have to evaluate the different times when people are outside the house, when is the rush hour, or I'm using that word, when most of the people walk by or go by car. So each case has to be evaluated on the basis of its own merits.
Would having a public lighting allow people without a house to say the brach of Sha'as Anisim, at least according to some opinions?
Well, clearly, if you're going to light your own candles in your house, so you should not make Sha'as Anisim when you see the Chanukah candles. Reb Chaim used to walk in the streets of Brisk with his hands over his eyes because he didn't want to be chayev, according to some shitos, to say Sha'as Anisim when he passed by a house that already had lit the candles. But the Ramah Shita is the ideal time to light to make the bracha of Sha'as Anisim is before you light. So we follow the opinion of the Ramah. Reb Chaim was choshesh for the Maharam Rutenberg's opinion. So even though if a person is not going to light, they can make the bracha on candles they see. But if they're going to light, the ideal time to make the bracha is before you light, and that's the psak of the Ramah.
But can you say that if according to that opinion that you can make a bracha if you're not lighting, so you can make a bracha for seeing it, but would it have to be candles that were lit to fulfill a mitzvah, which would have to be in a household or by a person, or if they're lit in a...
So that's the question that I said that has to be considered. The question is, when you light Hanukkah candles that are not required, whether that is considered
The halacha for your
Hanukkah
Chanukah.
candles or not. There is a little bit of a raya that it is considered Hanukkah candles from the Gemara that you mentioned earlier. And when you have two sides of the street, so you light in both windows or both doorways because people shouldn't suspect you didn't light. So technically, you're not doing it because of the requirement of Hanukkah. You're doing it because of the requirement of Marasayan. You understand? So even though there wasn't a Hanukkah requirement, why do we light? Maybe you were scared that somebody's going to make the brach of Shas and Nisim on it, and it's not Hanukkah candles. So that would be a proof that it is considered Hanukkah candles, since you're lighting it as Hanukkah candles, even though there is not a Hanukkah requirement. But we could suggest in the reverse that since there is Marasayan, if people will suspect that you didn't light Hanukkah candles, that takes away from the Persumei Nisa. So consequently, it's being lit for the mitzvah of Hanukkah candles, even though you don't make a bracha on it, since you made a bracha on the first set of Hanukkah candles.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be dependent on how you understand the sugya over there.
There's a lot of questions still.
That's fine.
Someone lives in Israel in a 16 apartment building. Some of the neighbors light outdoors, but there's no way to associate those lights with any particular household. Is that a problem, or is it better to light outside the apartment?
To me, it seems it's a machlokus between Rashi and Tosfos. Tosfos' opinion, you light at the doorway of the chutzner, and the chutzner had many houses. So there was no way to associate which candle is from which house. However, according to Rashi, that you have to light at the doorway of the house, so then we have to be concerned about the candles being identified with the owner of the house.
Why, if a wife is included with her husband lighting menorah, why do girls light their own?
A wife is included with the husband because of ishto kagufo, that a husband and wife is considered like one person. However, the girls, they are individuals, so they have to light their own candles.
I missed.
My uncle mentioned in a shir. I remember I attended that shir. My uncle mentioned in the shir the minute of the Beis Harav, the custom of the descendants of Reb Chaim Volozhiner was that married women also lit their own candles. And I asked my father, they could do that, just that there has to be kavanah, that they're not being yotze with the husband's candles. The only thing I'll say that might have been the minhag in Europe. I know that my mother did not light separate candles, and I was once Chanukah in my uncle's house, and the only set of candles that I wasn't staying over, I just came to visit him, and he was davening Ma'ariv when I walked in, and then he immediately went to light the Hanukkah candles, and I did not notice my aunt lighting a separate menorah. So that might have been the custom in Europe, in our family, but in America, that clearly was not the custom in our family.
So if a woman who was lighting candles for many years and then she got married, so she would stop lighting her own candles?
I would say that's this is where I would resort to the last Rambam. If, as far as I think, she could continue lighting her own candles if the husband won't be upset about it. But if the husband will be upset about it, even if the wife should evaluate, even if he says, I'm not upset, but if you know that he is upset, then it's probably not the proper thing to do. Chanukah emphasizes, as I said, the idea of shalom bayis, peace in the family. And we certainly should not go out of our way to light the candle in a manner that will cause strife in the family. Even if it's
what about Shalom
yeah.
the other way? If she'll be upset if he doesn't let her light. They'll both be upset if one lights or
They should visit a marriage counselor. Okay.
Someone said that they heard that your uncle had candles lighting all night long. I did hear about that in the morning.
Okay, I attended a share.
Night.
I attended a share where my uncle. You see, the Rambam says that a person should light the candles based on the Gemara until Techala Regel Minashuk. When you light outside, until people stop walking on the street. You understand? Until people stop walking on the street. So in other words, you have to light according to the Rambam. From the Rif, it doesn't appear that way. But according to Rambam, he says, Shehu kamo chatzi sha'o yeser, which is about a half hour or more. So you emphasize where the rush hour is more than a half hour, the candle, according to the Rambam, has to last more than a half hour. So my uncle's argument, that was at a share, his argument was, my father did not agree with this, but his argument was when you're lighting on the inside of the house and there is no presuming nisa on the outside of the house, again, that would depend on what section you live in. So you have to light until the presuming nisa is over inside the house. It has to last. So that means it should last so long as people in the house are either on the ground floor, he didn't say that, or they go to sleep. So that's so he would use long candles for that. Now the Magen Avrams, I think the Magen Avram and the Taz say explicitly that you don't have to do that, and they say that you just have to light it the same amount of time it would be for the outside of the house. And the reason is because when we light it inside the house, it's in place of candles that should have been lit outside the
house. If a woman, I guess a married woman whose husband lit, if she wants to start lighting herself, is that okay? If the husband's
again,
okay with
it goes back to what I said before. Everything should be evaluated on the basis of shalom bayis, and if there is an ongoing problem that would cause bad feelings between the two of them, they should see a marriage counselor.
Okay. So I think that's everything.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll share next week. Will it still be on Hanukkah, or
they'll be on the Chanukah, maybe on the Sedra also. We'll see.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, everything should go well. Everybody should have a happy Chanukah.
I mean, thank you.